Das we ni trong. One kiai. It was just past dawn when the first hint of trouble crept into the quiet streets of Maple Ridge, a sleepy town clinging to the edge of Missouri's rolling hills. The morning haze still clung to the sycamore-lined sidewalks as Deputy Marshal Hank Dawson idled in his patrol SUV behind the old brick post office. At 58, Hank had worn his badge longer than most people had known what it meant to respect it. His uniform, pressed creases on his trousers, polished boots he had doubtless marched in during his Kansas City police days, felt as much a part of him as skin. Yet in recent months, the changing faces moving into town had left him restless. There were more newcomers, Latino families, young professionals in snazzy Teslas, and black entrepreneurs opening coffee shops where empty storefronts once stood. Hank didn't mind progress. He just preferred that progress arrive at a pace he could trust. Down the block, sunlight bounced off the windows of the former bakery, now a minimalist tech showroom, but Hank's attention was fixed elsewhere. He had spotted her, tall, poised, and impeccably dressed, walking alone toward the courthouse. Her crisp navy blazer clung to her shoulders with practiced ease. Her caramel brown hair was pulled into a neat chignon. She carried a slim leather folio in one hand, and each step in her black stilettos sounded like confidence incarnate. She wasn't local, not in the way Hank understood local. He glanced around. No one else seemed to notice her. That in itself made him uneasy. Hank flipped on the siren lights, no whistle, just the quiet swirl of red and blue, and rolled forward. He followed her at a careful distance, rounding the corner onto Sycamore Street. The late summer air smelled of fresh mulch and cut grass, but Hank's nerves tasted of something acrid. Whoever she was, she didn't look intimidated. In fact, she didn't look at all bothered by the cruiser creeping up behind her. He jabbed the dashboard microphone. "Dispatcher, be advised. I'm initiating a stop on a pedestrian at the courthouse grounds." His voice sounded too brisk, too eager. She paused at the courthouse's wrought iron fence and glanced over her shoulder once, just once, but she kept walking. That annoyed Hank more than he cared to admit. He swung the SUV around, parked with a practiced roll of the tires, and stepped out, hand resting on his holstered pistol even though he didn't intend to draw it. "Morning, ma'am," he called out as he approached, voice steady but edged with the authority that came from years of delivering cold command. She turned to face him fully, her gaze direct and unflinching. "Good morning, officer," she replied. No nerves, no apology, just clear, even tones. "Is there an issue?" Hank squared his shoulders. He motioned to the courthouse behind her. "You realize this is federal property, right? It's been repurposed as a records archive, but it's still off-limits for loitering and unauthorized photography." She raised an eyebrow, lips curving in a polite but unmistakable line of defiance. "I'm on the sidewalk, sir, public sidewalk." Her voice carried neither fear nor anger. It carried certainty. Hank stepped closer, his patrol boots scuffing the concrete. "We've had reports of suspicious activity here. I need to see some form of identification." "Certainly." She tilted her head slightly and reached inside her tailored wool blazer, retrieving a slim leather wallet. With deliberate calm, she extended it to him. "My driver's license." He took the card. Miss Valerie Brooks, Missouri license, no local address, stood for a moment longer than necessary, scanning the details. No warrants, no alerts, yet unmarked territory made him uneasy. He flicked his eyes up to her face. "What brings you to Maple Ridge, Miss Brooks?" She offered a small, courteous smile, one edge of her mouth lifting gracefully. "Work. I'm here on assignment." The way she said assignment sounded like she had things under perfect control, like she planned every move. Assignment didn't sit right with Hank. He didn't like being outmaneuvered, especially on home turf. He handed back the license. "All right. But you'd best keep moving. No lingering around government buildings." She pocketed her wallet, met his gaze, and said, "Thank you for your concern, officer." "Dawson," he supplied. "Officer Dawson," she repeated, matching his formal tone. She turned on her heel and walked away, heels clicking in firm, even steps. Hank watched her go, a knot of frustration knotting in his gut. He shouldered his patrol jacket, tried to shake off the sensation that he had just lost a fight he hadn't known he was in. Back in his SUV, he rifled through the documents he'd printed earlier, her address, her license, nothing suspicious, bookmarking her name in his notepad with a sense of creeping obsession. 2 hours later, the local Facebook group Maple Ridge Neighbors lit up with shaky phone camera video shot from behind the courtroom curtains. The red and blue dance of his lights, his brisk stride, her composed hand handing over the license, and then, finally, the moment she turned and departed. Not hurried, not scared, just dignified. By noon, the clip had thousands of views. Comments flooded in. Sheriffs got every right to question strangers. She handled that like a pro. Grace under pressure. Why'd he stop her at all? The debate was already fracturing the town's polite consensus. Meanwhile, Ms. Brooks, who was really Special Agent Valerie Brooks of the Department of Homeland Security's Protective Services, sat miles away in a Tennessee diner, silent over a plate of biscuits and gravy, while her phone buzzed. She'd come to Maple Ridge anticipating anonymity, a brief site visit for a federal audit of municipal archives, yet she'd become the story instead of remaining the quiet observer. In Maple Ridge, Deputy Marshal Hank Dawson stared at his computer screen, replaying the video again. He tapped his pen against his desk. How had she made him feel so unsettled? He'd dealt with real danger, gunfights in KC's toughest neighborhoods, and nothing had rattled him like this calm, confident woman. He closed the browser and minimized her file, but her name, Valerie Brooks, lingered on his screen. Something told him this encounter was only the beginning. In a few days, he'd find himself facing her again, not on the sidewalk, but in a courtroom where the consequences of that morning's stop would unravel everything he thought he knew about power, authority, and the woman who defied him without ever raising her voice. Da suis ni trong, one jai. The morning light here wasn't nearly as forgiving as in Maple Ridge. By the time Special Agent Valerie Brooks slid into the booth at a quiet Murfreesboro, Tennessee diner, her custom leather folio felt heavier than it should. She sipped black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and stared out at an empty parking lot speckled with dew. On the table before her, her phone buzzed again. She ignored it, tracing the rim of her cup with a fingertip. She had expected that first stop in Ashwood Pines to be a quick in and out, a routine records audit of the small-town courthouse archives, part of a federal project shining light on how local law enforcement manages sensitive materials. She'd planned to observe quietly, note any red flags, and move on. Produce a clean, discreet report. No headlines, no fireworks, certainly no viral video of a small-town Deputy Marshal Hank Dawson flashing lights and demanding ID from a private citizen walking a public sidewalk. Yet here she was, 190 miles away, replaying that moment again in her head, the blue and red glow reflecting off the courthouse brick, his hand lingering on the grip of his holster, her own calm hand slowly retrieving her driver's license. And afterwards, his words, thinly veiled contempt echoing through the wind. You people need to remember your place around here. She'd be lying if she said she hadn't felt a flicker of anger, but she didn't flinch. That had been the point, strength under fire, so she'd walked away. But once the video hit social media, 2,000 views in 2 hours, thousands more by the afternoon, she realized this would not stay quiet. Her phone buzzed again. She let it ring into voicemail. Finally, she set her mug down and dialed. "Val?" said the familiar voice, low with concern. Theo Marshall, her Federal Protective Services director and longtime friend, was speaking from his office in Nashville. "How's Ashwood Pines?" she asked without preamble. "The town's in chaos," Theo reported. "They've seen the clip. Everyone's talking about you stopping on a public sidewalk. They're calling for the deputy's head, but they don't know who you are." "Good," she said, stirring her coffee. "They should know there's oversight." "I'm not sure they understand that," Theo hesitated. "We need to manage the politics. They're scheduling a hearing in 3 days, county courthouse, under the guise of a public disturbance complaint filed by Dawson himself. Valerie picked up her folio and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I thought you said the local prosecutor wouldn't take that seriously." "Didn't, at first," Theo sighed. "But the pressure's mounting. The sheriff's lobby, local council, even some regional legislators. They're siding with Dawson. They see an outsider messing with local tradition." She drained the rest of her coffee and motioned for the waitress to bring the check. "Make sure I have everything I need before I go back," she said. "Records, video files, witness statements, anything that shows this was a lawful stop and no more." Theo's voice took on steel. "Val, you'll have backup. I'm sending 2 more agents, one to testify on procedure, another to document. And I'm coordinating with DOJ and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Missouri to get an amicus brief ready." She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the din of clattering dishes and murmured conversations. She didn't feel nervous. She felt resolve. "All right," she said. "I'll be there tomorrow morning. Send me the details." She hung up, slid a 20 onto the table and stood. She told herself this would still count as a routine audit. But the truth was, she was going back not just to review dusty files, but to walk into the lion's den and to make them see that the badge she wore meant she spoke for a higher authority. Maple Ridge looked different under the late afternoon sun. The same sycamores cast long shadows across the courthouse yard as bustling folks poured in for the hearing. Residents clutching folding chairs and umbrellas lined up along the sidewalk. Others leaned from window sides, eyes curious. Early fall had begun to tinge the leaves, but the tension in the air was more electric than crisp breeze. Valerie arrived in an unmarked black Ford, accompanied by 2 colleagues in plain clothes. Special Agent Brian Vega, a procedure expert who would speak on the legality of civilian recording and stops, and Agent Carolyn Patel, who would testify about her own experience riding along with Dawson's department during a neutral oversight inspection last year. They emerged from the car looking every bit the professionals they were. As they walked up the courthouse steps, they caught sight of Deputy Marshal Hank Dawson. He stood flanked by 2 county attorneys, suit jacket buttoned, expression tight. The video had him at a disadvantage. He claimed his stop was necessary for security, but no one who watched the clip could deny the power imbalance. That imbalance would now be litigated. Valerie met his eye briefly. No glare, just recognition. Hank looked away, throat working as if he wanted to say something but couldn't gather the words. Inside the courtroom, the walls displayed portraits of former judges and county officials, almost all white men, each with robed dignity that now felt at odds with the moment's urgency. The judge, Honorable Maricel Carter, took the bench promptly at 9 o'clock. She was a tall woman in her 50s with silvering hair and steely eyes. Her gavels bore the seal of the 10th Judicial Circuit of Missouri, and once settled, she called the court to order. "Today's hearing," she announced, "will determine whether the complaint filed by Deputy Marshal Dawson against Ms. Valerie Brooks has merit, namely, whether his actions constituted an unreasonable detention or display of authority." Valerie sat at a long table, her folio open, laptop ready. Vega and Patel flanked her, calm and collected. Opposite them sat Hank, his own table strewn with printouts of his incident report and the dashcam log dashcam when for a stop on the adjacent street earlier that week. The county prosecutor began reading Dawson's statement. "On September 12th at approximately 7:15 a.m., I observed an unidentified black female appearing to photograph or record the exterior of the courthouse archives. Given recent security concerns, I initiated a field stop, requested identification, and confirmed she had no local business here." Valerie leaned forward when Vega took the stand. His testimony was crisp. Under Missouri law, Ms. Brooks had a right to photograph or record in any public space. The courthouse grounds are publicly accessible sidewalks. The deputy's lights and demand for ID, in absence of reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, constituted an overreach. Hank's attorney stood to object, loudly. "Objection, Your Honor. Agent Vega is speculating on standard patrol procedures, not local ordinances. This stop was entirely within Deputy Dawson's jurisdictional prerogative." Judge Carter cut him off with a single raised finger. "Overruled. Agent Vega's expertise on federal and state recording statutes is admissible. Please proceed." Next came Agent Patel. She described her ride along last spring, when the department was conducting a neutral safety assessment. "I observed a pattern," she said. "Local deputies, including Marshal Dawson, would routinely stop minority pedestrians for minor infractions, sometimes even jaywalking, then escalate encounters without clear cause." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. A handful of Maple Ridge residents shook their heads, whispering about witch hunts and outsiders, but others nodded thoughtfully. Then Valerie stood. She approached the stand with deliberate calm. Her tailored suit felt nothing like the harsh morning light in Ashwood Pines. She rested both hands on the lectern and spoke directly to the judge. "Your Honor, I am Special Agent Valerie Brooks of the Department of Homeland Security, Office of Federal Protective Services. My purpose in Ashwood Pines was to audit the handling of historical records repurposed as municipal archives. During that audit, I was approached by Deputy Marshal Dawson while walking on a public sidewalk. I complied immediately, provided identification, and posed no threat." She paused, letting the silence hang. "Under federal guidelines and consistent with Missouri's open records and open meetings statutes, any person in public spaces has the right to observe, record, and walk assigned routes without arbitrary detention. The deputy's red and blue lights, the order to produce ID, and the parting comment, 'You people need to remember your place,' reveal an abuse of power." A reporter in the back row leaned forward, her pen flying across a notebook. From the corner of her eye, Valerie saw Dawson's face harden, but she didn't look away. Judge Carter cleared her throat. "Brooks, do you have any evidence to further support your statement?" Valerie nodded and tapped a key on her laptop. A flat-screen monitor beside the judge flickered on. The courtroom filled with the hazy, handheld video from Sycamore Street. Hank's cruiser lights illuminating her, the patrol boots echoing on pavement, and the final parting shot of Hank's mouth. "You people need to remember your place." Gasps punctuated the hush. Even those who came to defend the deputy found themselves frozen. The judge studied the screen. "Deputy Marshal Dawson, do you wish to respond?" Hank swallowed. He rose with effort, voice taut. "Your Honor, I will stipulate to the facts of that video. However, during the stop, I had received a report of attempted unauthorized access to the archives." Valerie raised a single-gloved hand. "With respect, sir, you paused me on the public sidewalk 8 feet from the archives entrance. No citizen can be deemed attempted unauthorized for lawful presence." He hesitated, eyes flicking to her, then back to the judge. "I see." Judge Carter pinched the bridge of her nose. "This court recognizes the importance of security, but it also must protect civil liberties. Based on today's proceedings, Deputy Marshal Dawson's stop of Ms. Brooks lacked reasonable suspicion, and the use of emergency lights and authoritative commands here in public was unwarranted." She leaned forward. "This hearing will reconvene on Monday at 1:00 p.m. to determine appropriate remedies, including any departmental sanction. The court is now in recess." Valerie exhaled slowly and returned to her seat. Outside, the crowd lingered, some in muted applause, others quietly shocked that a small-town stop could land in federal court. Hank gathered his papers, shoulders slumped like new weight pressed upon them. Their eyes met for one charged moment, no hostility, only grudging acknowledgement that this was far from over. Valerie watched him turn and leave, then gathered her team. The field audit had become a battlefield and they had won the first skirmish, but she knew better than anyone that winning was just the start. The next steps would be about reform, retraining, and ensuring that no one in any small town felt their place depended on the luck of their skin. As they walked out into the fall air, The Fairfax County Courthouse loomed behind them, no longer a mere backdrop, but the site of a reckoning made possible by a single woman's quiet resolve. And Maple Ridge, once a postcard placeholder, was now a community awakened to the power of standing one's ground. Daswenitron, 1J. Agent Brian Vega leaned forward, eyes bright with purpose, as he cleared his throat to address the packed courtroom. He'd spent the past 6 months studying the intersection of federal and state statutes on recording in public, and today his expertise was on full display. Under Missouri Revised Statute Section 610.026, any person may record or photograph in any public space, he explained, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. That includes sidewalks, building exteriors, and publicly maintained promenades. In Ashwood Pines, that means the very stretch of Sycamore Street where Ms. Brooks was stopped. A few heads in the audience nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. Brian offered a brief, firm smile before continuing. Moreover, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Office of Federal Protective Services operates under a mandate to facilitate access, not obstruct it, unless there is credible evidence of imminent threat. In this instance, no such evidence existed. Across the aisle, Deputy Marshal Hank Dawson's attorney rose to object. Objection, Your Honor. Agent Vega is interpreting statutes without regard for situational exigencies. Judge Marisol Carter raised a hand, palm outward. Counselor, the objection is overruled. Agent Vega may continue. Hank's jaw clenched, but he stayed seated. Vega pressed on. In my controlled ride-along with the Ashwood Pines Marshal's Office last April, I observed similar stops, minor infractions followed by escalated encounters. In one case, a jogger was detained for loitering despite clear path markings. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom gallery. At the defense table, Hank's face drained of color, but he said nothing. Vega's testimony painted a pattern, and the courtroom, once solidly behind Marshall's discretion, now creaked with doubt. Next, Special Agent Caroline Patel approached the stand. Petite but unyielding, Caroline placed her hands on the lectern and unfolded a printed, time-stamped transcript of dispatch logs from March of the previous year. These logs document 3 separate instances in 2019 when the Marshal's office activated emergency lights on Sycamore Street in response to non-criminal pedestrian behavior. None posing actual threats. She tapped the printed page. Note the time intervals: 7 minutes to detain, 12 minutes to search, and 30 seconds to release without charges. Her delivery was dispassionate, clinical, yet powerful. The judge leaned forward, peering at Caroline over her reading glasses, taking in every detail. Now all eyes turned to the defense table as Hank was called to give his side one more chance before Ms. Brooks' own testimony. He rose unsteadily, clearing his throat. Your Honor, he began, voice tight, I stand by my actions. Security concerns have been raised about this courthouse. The initial reason for the audit, yes, but that doesn't negate my duty to investigate. Valerie Brooks caught his gaze from across the room. Calm and unshaken, she allowed him to finish before rising herself. Tall and composed, she smoothed the lapels of her navy blazer and approached the witness stand with deliberate poise. Judge Carter nodded toward her. Ms. Brooks, you may proceed. She took one measured breath, exhaled softly, and began. On the morning of September 12th, I walked the public sidewalk adjacent to the Ashwood County Courthouse Archives building. I was conducting a contextual audit, documenting building conditions and signage as permitted under federal codes for public spaces. Her voice was steady, measured, nothing theatrical, yet magnetic. When Deputy Marshal Dawson activated his lights and approached me, I complied immediately. I produced my government-issued driver's license, no hesitation, no pursuit. But then he uttered the phrase, "You people need to remember your place around here." A low gasp swept through the spectators. Even some who'd come to defend the deputy clamped their hands over their mouths, as if they could unhear it. Valerie paused, letting the weight of those words settle. That phrase, she continued, carries with it a history of exclusion, a legacy of segregation. It transformed what could have been a neutral safety check into a racially charged intimidation. Holding a small remote, she clicked a button. The monitor across the courtroom flickered to life, replaying the key segment of the handheld video. The grainy footage showed Dawson's cruiser lights pulsing against the courthouse facade, his boots stepping onto the public walkway, and Valerie's own hand extending her license across his field of vision. Then the final, parting glimpse of his lips, perfectly legible in the close-up. "You people need to remember your place." Silence fell, thick as syrup. The judge adjusted her glasses and tapped her gavel gently. "Ms. Brooks, thank you. No further questions." Valerie returned to her seat, taking care not to look at Dawson. She sat, hands folded, exuding quiet dignity. Her two supporting agents exchanged solemn nods. Judge Carter called for closing statements. The county prosecutor began with rote formalisms, but the conviction was gone. The script had been flipped, the lines no longer fit. Finally, the judge's gavel came down again. "Based on the testimonies of Agents Vega and Patel, the corroborating video evidence, and Ms. Brooks's own account, I find that Deputy Marshal Dawson's actions exceeded the bounds of reasonable law enforcement protocol. He lacked probable cause to detain her. He misused emergency lighting, and his parting remarks indicate an element of racial hostility." A murmur rose like distant thunder, gasps, quiet admonitions, a few discreet applause. Judge Carter raised her hand. "This court will reconvene on Monday at 1:00 p.m. to determine appropriate corrective measures, ranging from formal reprimand to suspension pending retraining in civil rights enforcement. I further recommend that the Ashwood County Sheriff's Office institute mandatory bias awareness programs for all personnel." Valerie exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that day. She caught Theo's eye and offered a small, grateful nod. Outside the courtroom, the Maple Ridge sun glinted off the gold seal of justice on the courthouse door, a symbol at last that what happens on a public sidewalk matters to every citizen. As she walked down the steps with Brian Vega and Caroline Patel, the press corps moved in, flashbulbs popping, but Valerie held her composure. She knew the battle wasn't over. Training, policy reform, community healing lay ahead, but today, she had stood her ground. And that made all the difference. Da, soy, interong, one, j. The next morning, an uneasy hush settled over Maple Ridge. News of Judge Carter's findings had rippled through every corner of the county, and the sheriff's office felt like a living organism rattled by a sudden tremor. Inside the brightly lit briefing room, Captain Marisa Nguyen stood before a half-empty coffee urn, running a hand through her steel blonde ponytail. At 38 years old, she was among the younger command staff, one of the few who had quietly supported Valerie Brooks when the rest of the department bristled with resentment. Today, she prepared to face the fallout. A dozen deputies filed in, folding takeout cups into cup holders as they sat. Lieutenant Carlos Mendoza, a 25-year veteran with salt and pepper sideburns and weary eyes, cleared his throat. "Listen up," he said, voice low but firm. "We're here to figure out how to move forward. Judge Carter's order is crystal clear. Bias, training, suspension, policy review. It's not optional." Captain Gwynn clicked a remote and the projector hummed to life against the far wall. The title slide read, "Maple Ridge Marshal's Office. Bias Awareness and Community Trust." A murmur ran through the room. Some deputies exchanged glances, others stared at the floor. Nguyen squared her shoulders and tapped the slide. "I know a lot of you feel blindsided, maybe even betrayed, by how quickly things escalated with Ms. Brooks. We all thought we were doing our jobs. But Judge Carter reminded us yesterday, public safety isn't just about enforcement. It's about respect for every person's rights, guaranteed by both Missouri law and the U.S. Constitution." Her words hung in the air as Deputy Kara Simmons, fresh from the academy and already bristling with frustration, raised a hand. "With all due respect, Captain, Miss Brooks wasn't some random pedestrian. She was a federal agent. She pulled a badge on us." Nguyen met Simmons's gaze and nodded. Yes, and she was within her rights to clarify her identity. Let's not pretend that had she been someone else, someone without a federal badge, she wouldn't have been treated the same way. Our policies apply to every person, regardless of rank, age, or uniform. We need comprehensive reevaluation from top to bottom. Carlos flipped the slide to the next bullet points. 1. Mandatory civil rights refresher. 2. Walk and talk community detail. 3. Revised field stop protocol. 4. Body-worn camera compliance review. Simmons scoffed. Body cams are fine on paper, but how many of us have seen footage get twisted? Who's to say the public won't just edit out our best actions? Nguyen folded her arms. Then let them try. Transparency builds trust. We can't selectively enforce rights. We either commit to change or we lose the community's confidence entirely. Remember the editorial in the Maple Ridge Times yesterday? It said we're at a crossroads, adapt or become obsolete. An uncomfortable silence followed. Deputy Mason Clark, a gravel-voiced former Marine, shifted. So, what's the timeline? Nguyen clicked again. Effective today, every officer will begin a 16-hour bias awareness course led by state-certified instructors. By next Monday, suspension letters and retraining assignments go out to anyone serving less than 5 years until they complete the course. Senior officers, like Lieutenant Mendoza and me, will attend an advanced workshops on community policing and constitutional law over the next 2 weeks. Clark slumped. That cuts into patrol time. Nguyen's blue-green eyes flashed. It cuts into complacency time. We owe it to ourselves and the public. If we don't do this, the next time someone records an unjust stop, we all look guilty by association, and 3 phone videos go viral in 3 hours. Lieutenant Mendoza cleared his throat. We'll need coverage. I suggest a rotating schedule where half the force is in training while the other half covers shifts. Overtime budget's already stretched thin, but we can propose an emergency allocation to the city council. Nguyen nodded. Good. I'll bring it up at today's interagency meeting with Mayor Thompson. In parallel, we're launching a walk and talk detail. Pairs of deputies will patrol community parks on foot, engaging residents, answering questions, and demonstrating that we're more than engines and lights. Deputy Simmons frowned. People won't talk to us. They'll think it's another show. Nguyen leaned forward. Then we'll show them something real. Captain Brooks herself offered to help design a Q&A session at City Hall. Anonymous questions on civil rights, police powers, even department concerns. We'll post flyers in English and Spanish. We'll bring refreshments. We'll let people know they have a voice beyond a Facebook post. Clark nodded slowly. And the standards for field stops? Nguyen clicked to the next slide. Revised field stop protocol. Reasonable suspicion defined, recording and citizen rights, supervisor approval for prolonged detentions, documentation transparency. From now on, she said, every stop that lasts longer than 3 minutes must be approved by a supervisor. Every encounter must be fully documented. Reason for stop, citizen's response, timestamps, and the right to be recorded must be read aloud. If you fail to follow this protocol, it'll be in your record and used in performance reviews. Simmons huffed. So now we're micromanaged. Nguyen's tone softened. We're being held accountable. That's different from micromanagement. It's how we rebuild trust. She advanced the slide to a photo montage. Smiling deputies shaking hands with seniors at a picnic, officers tossing a football with teenagers on the high school field, 4 patrol cars dotting different neighborhoods for the walk and talk. I don't expect us to transform overnight, Nguyen concluded, but these changes start today, right here in this room. If you believe in serving this community, you'll embrace it. If not, well, there's the back door. Because those who stand on the sidelines while history turns become part of its forgotten past. Her final words cut through the room like a bell. No applause followed, only a charged gravity. Meanwhile, across town, in the echoing corridors of Maple Ridge City Hall, Valerie Brooks and Director Theo Williams convened with Mayor Linda Thompson and City Administrator Grace Park. Mayor Thompson, in her early 50s with a precise auburn bob, sipped iced tea and watched the federal agents set out a color-coded timeline. Thompson adjusted her glasses. "We appreciate your support, Agent Brooks, but these reforms will need City Council approval and funding. Some of our senior donors have already raised concerns about increased training costs and overtime." Grace Park, a brisk former nonprofit executive turned administrator, sighed. "We can reallocate from the Community Development Fund, but that shrinks the affordable housing budget. It's a zero-sum game." Valerie offered a reassuring nod. "Mayor Thompson, these measures aren't a luxury. They're an investment in safety and goodwill. Surveys show that when citizens trust their law enforcement, crime reporting increases, investigations improve, and community-led initiatives flourish. That, in turn, reduces costs in the long term." Theo chimed in. "Plus, federal grant opportunities exist for departments undergoing bias remediation. We can co-sponsor applications to offset training expenses and equipment upgrades, especially for body-worn cameras and data management systems." Mayor Thompson exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "All right, on one condition. We schedule a joint public forum within the month, featuring Agent Brooks, Sheriff Lopez in an advisory role, and community representatives. Let the people see us working together, not opposing forces." Valerie's lips curved in a sly, genuine smile. "Consider it done." Back at the marshal's office, the first group of deputies filed out of Classroom C, where instructors had just concluded the first module on implicit bias and constitutional rights. Outside, Deputy Simmons lingered by the water cooler, swirling a coffee stirrer. Deputy Clark approached, folding his arms. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "That training hit harder than I expected. I didn't realize how blind I'd been." Simmons looked surprised. "Yeah?" Clark nodded, eyes down. "I never thought about what it feels like to be recorded, or even just eyed suspiciously, day after day. I want to do better." She offered him a wry half-smile. "Same boat. Guess we're seafaring together." He returned the smile with a nod. That afternoon, Captain Nguyen strode along the south bank of Maple Creek, flanked by Deputies Clark and Simmons on their first walk and talk. A small crowd gathered, a mix of joggers, dog walkers, parents with strollers. Nguyen greeted everyone by name, having memorized the regulars during her patrols. When a teenage girl with neon pink earbuds hesitated, Gwen paused. "Hi. I'm Captain Gwen. How's your day?" The girl's eyes widened. "You remember my name?" "Of course," Gwen replied. "Your dog Brutus, the Schnauzer puppy, right?" The teen's worry melted into laughter. "Yeah, my mom worries brutes like me too." Simmons joined in, crouching to pet Brutus. "He's adorable, and your playlist's awesome." The girl beamed. "Thanks. You guys aren't so bad." Nguyen stood, scanning her deputies. "See? Trust goes two ways." A little further on, they passed an older man painting the creek's bank in watercolors. Deputy Clark paused. "Nice work, sir." The man looked up, surprised. "Oh, thank you." Clark asked about his art, his grandchildren's names, his walking route. By the time Nguyen turned a corner, she heard animated conversation about new patrol details, promises of speed limit signs, and the man's hope that this just sticks. When the sun set that evening over Maple Ridge, the marshal's office felt smaller, more human. Captain Nguyen returned from patrol to find the first batch of signed training acknowledgement forms on her desk, Deputy Simmons's among them. A sticky note jutted out. "Thank you for leading us right, Captain. Kara." Nguyen smiled softly and placed the note in her pocket, proof that change, once sparked, could warm even the coldest halls. And somewhere in that quiet dusk, downtown Maple Ridge breathed a little easier, hopeful that injustice, once exposed, could be rooted out before it choked the life from the community it had long claimed to protect. Da Sui Nik Trong Bai Chi. The following morning, the Maple Ridge community awoke to headlines that no one could ignore. Judge Carter's ruling spurs major overhaul at Marshal's office. Maple Ridge to introduce body cameras after federal intervention. Captain Gwynn leads new era of community policing. Radio hosts rang in with commentary. Social media buzzed with gratitude and cautious optimism, and even the normally reticent downtown cafe patrons found themselves nodding along as they debated what these changes would mean for their town. Inside the Marshal's office, Part 5 of our story truly began. Because change isn't declared in a courtroom, it's lived day by day in every interaction. The first checkpoint came with the rollout of body-worn cameras. Deputy Simmons, wrenching the tiny mount onto her uniform, admitted to Captain Gwynn that she felt naked without it, until she flicked it on and realized the real exposure was her own good intentions, captured unfiltered alongside her mistakes. In training sessions, deputies watched footage of themselves, halting a solo jogger by the riverbank, patting down an elderly man for safety, and misreading a teenager's laughter as defiance. Each clip forced a reckoning. Not who they thought they were, but who they showed themselves to be. Simultaneously, the walk and talk outreach expanded. What began as pairs of deputies and a captain casually greeting neighbors became a coordinated neighborhood schedule, complete with multilingual flyers, Sunday church breakfasts co-hosted by Marshal's office volunteers, and weeknight coffee with a cop at the library. Captain Nguyen insisted that every deputy clock at least 4 walk miles per month, no vehicle allowed, so they'd feel the weight of the night breeze, hear children playing in yards, and learn that real safety is built on relationships, not quotas. In the hush of the archives wing at City Hall, Director Theo Williams and Mayor Thompson watched metrics climb. 37% more 911 calls in the first 2 weeks from areas once labeled low cooperation, a 22% uptick in traffic ticket challenges that ended with warnings rather than fines, and, most importantly, a drop in citizen-initiated complaint calls by nearly half. A sign that a wary public was starting to trust that their rights would be honored, not questioned. But the real test lay in the revised field stop protocol. It went live on a crisp Tuesday under the watchful eyes of Judge Carter, who had quietly come to observe. He sat with arms folded as Deputy Clark, once a hardened skeptic, voiced the right-to-record script verbatim to an elderly couple walking their golden retriever. He asked with genuine curiosity where they lived, how long they'd called Maple Ridge home, and if they had any safety concerns. Instead of tension, laughter followed as they raved about the city's fall festival. Judge Carter quietly cracked a smile. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse steps, Valerie Brooks returned, the federal agent whose stand had triggered this entire chain of events. She'd come to see it through, offering to lead a special Q&A at City Hall that evening. When she arrived, she found Captain Gwynn, Deputy Simmons, and Lieutenant Mendoza already setting up chairs in a semicircle. A banner over the door read, "Your rights, our duty. Open forum with Marshal's office and DHS." As dusk settled, more than 200 residents crowded in. Among them were retired teachers clutching notebooks, parents clutching toddlers' hands, local business owners leaning forward, and college students live streaming on their phones. Valerie took the microphone first, recounting her own experience. "I never set out to make headlines. I simply asked to be treated like any other citizen on a public sidewalk, and I was ready to face the consequences. What I found instead was a community willing to do better." Captain Gwynn followed, candidly acknowledging her early resistance. "I'll admit it, I was defensive. I didn't want to believe that the oath I'd taken at the academy needed an update, but I learned that an oath doesn't protect you from blind spots. I learned that humility is a shield, not a sign of weakness." Her voice cracked slightly when she added, "And I learned that trust, once broken, isn't easily mended, so we have to start every day by offering it anew." Deputy Simmons and Clark then addressed specific questions about body cam playback, data privacy, and how citizens could request footage. When an older woman asked, How will I know my tape won't be doctored? Simmons produced a printed flowchart of the chain of custody process, then clicked to show an online portal that allowed residents to track requests in real time. The crowd murmured in appreciation as she guided them through the step-by-step safeguards. Judge Carter closed the evening by reminding everyone that the changes in Maple Ridge weren't a one-off event but a pilot for other towns across Missouri. Accountability, transparency, and respect are the cornerstones of legitimate policing. Maple Ridge has shown that when you center your practices on those values, when you treat every resident as an equal partner in public safety, you don't just reduce crime, you build stronger communities. His eyes met Captain Nguyen's in the front row, and she nodded, shoulders set with renewed purpose. As the doors closed behind the last few visitors, Captain Nguyen turned to Valerie and offered a tired but genuine smile. "Thank you for pushing us to this point." Valerie simply replied, "Keep it going. Don't let it become the new baseline. Make it the only way we do things." The next morning, the marshal's office parking lot buzzed with new energy. Deputies gathered not under humming fluorescent lights, but outside in the dawn breeze, sharing coffee and planning which neighborhoods they'd patrol on foot. A bulletin board near the roll call desk featured handwritten thank you notes from children, photos from last night's forum, and a large printed sheet listing our shared principles: respect, transparency, accountability, service. Captain Nguyen slid one more sticky note onto it in bold Sharpie. "Today we earn trust again, one step at a time." And with that, she tapped her radio, called out her first assignment of the day, and led her team into the sunrise, knowing that real change didn't live in policies alone, but in every respectful conversation, every honored right, and every moment when a badge meant protection instead of power. As the sun dipped below the Ozark Hills, Maple Ridge wasn't the same town it had been that morning. The marshal's office, once an ivory tower of unchallenged authority, had become a place of partnership, where every camera click, every sidewalk greeting, and every open forum was an invitation to rebuild trust, brick by brick. Captain Nguyen and her team learned that real safety isn't enforced by power alone, but earned through empathy, transparency, and accountability. Grace Holloway's quiet courage reminded everyone that asking to be treated like an equal isn't a crime, it's the spark that ignites lasting reform. Judge Carter's patience and wisdom showed that the rule of law shines brightest when it safeguards the vulnerable, not shields the privileged. Mayor Thompson and Director Williams proved that measurable change, body cameras, de-escalation training, community audits, can emerge from a single moment of moral clarity. This story teaches us that integrity isn't granted by uniforms or badges, but upheld by everyday actions, listening without judgment, admitting mistakes, and choosing respect over control. When we treat every neighbor as a partner in public safety, we reshape institutions from within and leave a legacy of trust that no headline can erase. If this video spoke to you, drop a 1 in the comments to share your support. If you think there's room to make our storytelling even more compelling, hit 0 and let us know how we can improve.